Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot returned a locket from his mother. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And once the story is over, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. Winter winds howled across the wide Montana plains, carrying with them the lonely strains of a harmonica drifting from somewhere far away. Along a narrow trail dusted with snow, the steady beat of horse hooves struck the frozen ground, kicking up the last dry red dust left from autumn. Eli Turner's ranch stood alone at the base of the mountain, its roof blanketed in white, the chimney breathing thin ribbons of smoke into the heavy morning fog. He was checking the horse stalls when from the curtain of mist ahead, a massive figure emerged. Bigfoot. Its breath curled into pale clouds in the frigid air, and in one thick fur-covered hand it clutched a silver locket. The metal glimmered under the gray sky, identical to the one his mother had lost so many years ago. In that moment, Eli realized he wasn't standing before a predator, but before a story no one had ever told. I thought it was gone forever. On the high plains of Montana, winter draped the grasslands in a thin veil of white. Cold winds swept through, making the old wooden fences creak and groan as if they were complaining to the sky. Eli Turner, 55, kept his ranch tucked against the foot of the mountains, a weathered roof overhead, a chimney sending up steady ribbons of gray smoke each morning. He was the kind of man from the old west, hands worn from work, a rifle hanging by the door, and an aging horse waiting out in the corral. For years, Eli had risen before the sun, splitting a few logs, filling the water trough, and riding the fence line. No one came. No one left. This morning was no different, until something he thought was lost forever found its way back. In the quiet, frozen calm, something was about to shatter the stillness. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Part 1. The Figure in the Fog. A winter morning draped the forest's edge in a thick white shroud, wrapping itself around the pine trunks like a heavy blanket. Eli Turner pulled on his worn leather gloves, the chill seeping into the seams, and stepped out from the horse stall axe, still warm from his grip. Out in the distance, the grasslands stretched all the way to the mountain's base, swallowed in a pale gray haze. Somewhere beyond the mist, the echo of a gunshot drifted in from town, muffled, distant like an old bell tolling through layers of fog. Eli had lived his whole life with that sound, the morning call of the Old West, where every man knew to keep a gun within arm's reach. His eyes swept toward the tree line where the fog was so dense everything blurred into shadows. Then, a slow movement took shape. A tall form, broad-shouldered with a long, steady stride. Eli froze. For several seconds there was only the wind and the sound of his own heartbeat. The figure didn't hide. It kept coming, each step pressing through the space between two worlds, one belonging to man, the other to something still unnamed. The fog curled around it, slowing every movement, making them heavy, but not clumsy. Eli's hand found the worn grip of the revolver at his hip. He remembered the old dust storms, how the cattle would scatter and he'd ride hard into the wind-eyes, burning hands fixed to the reins. This felt the same danger somewhere ahead, not yet showing its face. A dry branch snapped beneath the stranger's weight. Eli shifted his stance, feeling the thin crust of snow crunch under his boots like breaking glass. He knew this would be unlike any meeting he'd ever had. 10 paces now. The shape grew clearer, over 7 feet tall, its frame draped in thick, dark brown hair breath, pouring out in pale clouds against the winter air. Eli tightened his grip on the gun, but didn't raise it. There was something in its gait, not quite threatening, not quite fleeing. A gust swept across the grasslands behind him, carrying the distant noise of cattle, startled somewhere far away. For a moment, Eli felt caught between two worlds: behind him, the life he knew. Ahead, the mystery walking toward him. Then just a few steps away, it stopped. Eyes glimmered through the fog, deep dark but not hostile. They fixed on Eli as though weighing him, as though making sure he wouldn't turn and run. Eli stood his ground. He'd known suspicious stares in saloons when stepping into a strange town, but this was different. It wasn't looking for weakness. It was asking a question without words. The mist rolled between them, and Eli drew a deep breath, the cold cutting through his chest, but not pushing him back. The figure shifted to the side, revealing one massive hand holding something. In the dim light, Eli saw it, a silver locket. His chest tightened. It was identical to the keepsake his mother had lost so many years ago. The creature didn't move closer. It simply stood there, arm extended through the fog as if offering or challenging. Eli knew if he turned away, this would be the end. But if he stayed, he'd be stepping into a story no soul in the West would ever believe. And if you stood in the fog face to face with a legend holding your family's lost heirloom, would you take it or would you walk away? Part 2. The Unexpected Gift. The front yard of the ranch lay buried beneath a fresh blanket of snow. Each step Eli took left deep prints, the crunch of ice echoing under his boots. Winter wind lashed his face, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth from the forest. Somewhere far off, gunfire drifted across the plains, a fading echo from a world he'd left behind, a world of dust storms, stampeding cattle, and the guarded stares of strangers in saloon doorways. The towering figure stood still at the fence line, its breath curling into the cold air like pale smoke. It didn't hide. It didn't hurry. Eli closed the gap slowly, each heartbeat louder than the last. Bigfoot lifted a massive hand to its chest. Resting in the thick fur-covered palm was something small, catching what little light the winter morning offered, a silver locket. The silver had dulled with time, its surface scratched and worn, but the engraving on the front stopped Eli cold. A 6-petaled wildflower, the same one his mother used to sketch in the margins of her old Bible. And inside that locket, if memory served, was the only photograph ever taken of his entire family before she passed. The wind picked up, whipping the snow in circles around them, but Eli no longer felt the cold. It was as though the moment had locked him in place, his gaze fixed on that small, fragile piece of metal that carried the weight of an entire lifetime. He stepped closer, reaching out slowly. When his fingertips brushed the icy surface, a flood of memory crashed through him. Summer at 13, when his mother had pressed this locket into his hand before his father left for weeks on the trail. The bitter winter morning 2 years later, when it vanished in a ranch robbery whose thief he never found. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the feeling that he was touching his mother's hand across decades. Bigfoot didn't pull away. It simply let Eli take the locket, its gaze calm, as if fulfilling a promise. Eli tightened his grip around it, stepping back to meet the creature's eyes. There was no threat in that deep, dark stare, only something that felt like understanding. As if Bigfoot knew exactly what this meant and had not returned it by accident, but out of intent. A gust roared through the pines, its pitch like the low howl that sweeps the plains before a sandstorm. And Eli realized, just like the old ranch hands who spoke little but lived by their word, this creature had kept a promise Eli never knew had been made. They stood there in silence, the only sounds the wind and the brittle snap of snow beneath the heavy pine branches. Eli knew he was at a crossroads. Close the door and treat this as a strange twist of fate, or follow the trail of the being before him and find the truth. Bigfoot took a step back, then turned toward the forest, its shoulder tilting slightly as if beckoning him. Eli glanced down at the locket in his hand, then back to the massive figure dissolving into the white fog. If a legend handed you a family heirloom you thought was gone forever, would you follow to learn why? Part 3. When Memories Return. Eli stood frozen in the snow-covered yard, his breath spilling into the air in thin, white streams. In his hand, the silver locket caught the dim winter light, sending out a faint but stubborn glimmer. He brushed away the thin crust of frost clinging to its surface, his fingertips tracing each scratch as if reading a weathered book. Far away, the echo of gunfire rolled in from the plains, pulling at the edges of his awareness, a reminder that this was still the Old West, where every story could end in violence. But here, in this moment, the world had shrunk to the small circle of metal resting in his palm. His fingers trembled as he unfastened the clasp. A soft click and the locket opened. Inside, an old photograph appeared, its colors faded to sepia edges, frayed with time. Yet the face of the woman within was clear enough to stop his heart. His mother. Long hair, gentle eyes, a smile tilted just slightly toward the camera. Eli closed his eyes, and the past swept over him like wind across a summer prairie, the sound of her voice calling from the doorway when he wandered too far along the fence line, the scent of fresh apple pie, the warmth of her hand on his shoulder when a dust storm forced them all into the storm cellar. Memories he thought buried under the red dust of time rose up alive again. He lowered himself to the wooden steps of the porch, the locket still nestled in his hand. The wind picked up scattering light snow across the yard. He thought of that winter morning long ago when gunshots and pounding hooves shattered the stillness, leaving behind an empty ranch and a missing locket. From that day on, he had closed his heart, living like a traveler passing through life, neither searching nor hoping. Yet now, what he believed lost forever had returned not from human hands, but from a creature of legend. And that changed everything. It made him wonder if the stories he'd doubted all his life might just hold some truth. Bigfoot still stood at the edge of the yard, unmoving. Snow gathered on its shoulders and brow, but its gaze never left Eli. In that silence, Eli felt another kind of language, respect, understanding, and perhaps an apology for what had once been taken. In the West, men offered trust through action, not words. And Eli realized the creature before him was doing exactly that. This wasn't a trade. This was a return, freely given. He closed the locket, slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, and pressed his hand over his chest as if to keep the warmth of the gift close. Looking toward the forest where the pines swayed in the wind, he murmured a promise to his mother he would find out why this had come back to him. Bigfoot turned, starting toward the trees, but slowly leaving Eli room to choose. In the West, some decisions could change the rest of a man's life. If you were given back a family heirloom you thought gone forever, would you let it walk away or would you follow? Part 4. The Moment of Understanding. Snow blanketed the ranch yard, the wind rattling the fence boards so they groaned like old timber telling its age. Eli stood there, the locket now resting in his coat pocket, his hand still pressed over his chest. Just a few paces away, Bigfoot stood tall, its breath drifting into the cold in thick white clouds. Far in the distance, the echo of gunfire rolled across the plains, bouncing off the mountain walls before fading into the frozen air. In the West, such sounds were nothing unusual, yet today they seemed to serve as the quiet rhythm to this strange, suspended moment. Neither man nor creature moved. The space between them was more than a few steps. It was the line between two worlds. Eli locked eyes with Bigfoot. There was no flare of aggression there, no glint of fear. Instead, he saw what he'd once glimpsed in the eyes of old cowboys: steadfastness, understanding, and a nameless sorrow. The wind rose, sweeping snow in circles around them as if trying to erase the border between human and legend. Eli remembered the days he'd sat his saddle alone in a dust storm, the cattle scattering with nothing to rely on but instinct and a fragile hope that he'd make it through alive. That same fragile trust was here now in the gaze of Bigfoot. No words passed, but Eli knew this was not an enemy. Bigfoot stood still, head slightly tilted, as if making certain the locket had been delivered into the right hands. The silence wasn't the tense stillness before a gunfight. It was the wordless nod of two Western men parting ways after a quiet understanding. In that moment, Eli felt the distance shrink, not through footsteps, but through acceptance. His fingers brushed the coat pocket where the locket rested. He didn't know where Bigfoot had found it, or why it had chosen to return it to him. But he was certain of one thing: this was no accident. Behind it was a purpose, and behind that purpose a story untold. In the West, when someone gives you something they could have kept, it's a promise. And this promise, Eli felt in his bones, didn't need the language of men. Bigfoot gave the faintest tilt of its head, then drew a deep breath, the white plume of it mixing with the winter wind. A final gust swept through the yard, shaking snow from the eaves, so it fell in slow drifting flakes between them. Bigfoot turned toward the forest, taking long, deliberate steps, never once looking back. Eli watched, a quiet urge in him to follow, but he also knew that sometimes trust means letting the other walk away without pursuit. And in that moment, Eli understood this was only the beginning. And if fate brought them together again, he would be ready to hear the rest of the story. If you stood before a legend you trusted, would you let it go or follow to find the answers? Part 5. The Footprints That Lead. The north wind whipped along the forest's edge, making the tall pines sing like taut fiddle strings. Snow lay ankle-deep, covering every hump of dry grass and jagged stone, save for the deep, deliberate prints sunk into the frozen ground. Each hollow cradled a thin halo of mist, its rim edged with pale blue ice-proof. Beyond any man's doubt, something had passed this way. Eli stopped at the 17th track. He knelt, his leather glove pressing into the hardened snow, hearing the faint crackle like salt grains breaking under his fingers. Far-off gunfire echoed from the open range, bouncing against the mountains, a familiar refrain in the west still playing, even as something no man would believe unfolded before him. The wind herded ribbons of white fog into the forest's edge, swallowing the horizon. Bigfoot had vanished into the trees, leaving only a trail of prints climbing toward the mountains. No command, no demand, just a silent invitation. Eli touched the pocket where his mother's locket rested against his heart. He drew a deep breath. Every trail he'd ever ridden, every dust storm he'd weathered, every scattered herd he'd brought back together, they all seemed to converge on this moment. He stepped into the first print, then the second, then the third. The trail cut across a winter-flat meadow. Here the wind gathered the last red dust of autumn, whipping it into thin lines across the snow. In each swirl of grit, Eli heard the echo of hoofbeats from years past, when he'd driven a herd through a narrow pass before the sandstorm hit. The ragged breaths of his old gelding, his own voice shouting hoarse in the haze of dust and sweat. In the meadow's heart, the prints stopped. On the snow lay a braided stalk of grass, crossed like an arrow, its tip pointing toward the mountain's flank. Eli picked it up, turning it in his fingers. Braided not by chance, a habit, a signal. He scanned the ground, no human tracks, no horseshoe marks, no drag lines from a wagon, only the steady, solitary trail of something that knew how to leave signs for a follower. A flock of black crows burst from the low brush, their wings clapping like pages in a book snapping shut. From somewhere beyond, gunfire came again, sharp, then gone. Eli gripped the locket through his coat, hearing the quiet drum of his own heartbeat against the metal. He remembered every skeptical stare in the saloon when he'd told stories no one wanted to believe. Today, he didn't need their belief. He only needed to keep walking. The mountain trail was slick and broken, the rocks glazed with ice like panes of glass. The prints angled toward a deep cut in the slope where young pines grew in a straight row like extinguished candles. Eli placed his boot in the 40th print, his body pitching as the ice slid beneath him. He caught a tree root, the sharp scent of pine sap snapping him back into focus. From the pass, the wind came shrill, half train whistle, half the distant call of a long-gone cowhand. Eli reached the narrow throat of the mountain where the ground was no wider than 2 feet. The tracks ended at the lip, as if the creature had leapt clear across. He looked down, a black void below. The snow stretched thin like powdered sugar over a deep fracture. Eli uncoiled the rope from his belt, tied it to a pine stump, and swung across. His body hit the cold, rock-hard boots, skidding knee-scraping through the fabric with a burn of ice. He pulled himself onto the far side, lying still, lungs heaving. When he rose, the prints began again, deep, round, steady, as if to nod silently at the man who had passed the test. Somewhere far down in a hollow, a lone cow bawled, bringing back every memory of pulling strays from bog and marsh. Only today there was no herd. Only Eli the mountain and an invitation cut deeper into stone and snow. The trail wound into a stand of old pines, their trunks swollen and split like the wrists of old cow hands. On the third tree to the left, Eli saw a faint carving likely 20 winters old. He brushed away the moss. A 6-petaled wildflower ringed in a thin circle, emerged the exact mark etched into his mother's locket. A coldness rose from his chest to his throat. This was no trick of fate. This was human work. Someone had left this here. His father, a riding companion, or the one who'd stolen the locket all those years ago. Beneath the carving on the snowy ground, lay a small knot of hemp rope tied neat in the old cattleman's hitch. Eli picked it up, rolling it in his palm. The scent of aged fiber split into dust, and with it came a rush of memory. The old porch, his mother's humming, his father's hands showing him how to tie a knot firm enough to outlast a storm. A light snow squall swept through the grove, the pine needles rattling like dry hail. Through the white haze, Eli thought he saw a tall shape slip between two trunks, then vanish, a quiet sign. Right way. Don't ask. Keep moving. By late afternoon, the sky pressed low and gray, the light flattening behind the mountain. The great prints thinned, then disappeared at the edge of a dense cedar stand where the wind had whipped the snow into folds, erasing all trace. Nothing left to follow, only the whine of wind and the sharp tang of resin. Eli stood still, listening to his heart under the thick coat, to the echo of all his solitary years tapping in his bones. He took out the locket, opened it for a moment, and pressed it to his lips, a thank you through cold metal sent to his mother, his father, and the shadow that had returned their bond. He tore a strip of red from his scarf and tied it to a low cedar branch, a Westerner's sign left for an unseen companion. A quiet message: I was here. I understand. I'll be back. The wind shifted, carrying the faint, dying scent of pine smoke like the breath of a fire long since banked. Somewhere in those trees, there might be a cave. There might be a story that had been waiting for him his whole life. But night was coming, and the West did not forgive a man who challenged its darkness unprepared. Eli turned back toward the ranch, each boot print pacing alongside a line of wind-drawn trails in the snow. Behind him, the cedar grove darkened, sealing its secret, not to hide it, but to keep the invitation safe until morning. On the way home, the day's last gunshots echoed once more. Eli didn't turn. He'd heard another call, quieter but deeper than any sound a man could make. And if it were you, would you ride home, light your fire, and return come morning? Or would you take the risk step into the dark timber tonight and see where those tracks truly lead? The ending night at the ranch was so still, Eli could hear the wood contracting in the cold. The fireplace crackled softly, its amber glow dancing across the log walls, stretching his shadow long and thin, as if it were whispering with the past. On the table, the silver locket lay open, reflecting the warm firelight. Eli rose and walked to the photograph of his mother hanging in the corner, a picture that had been there since he was a boy. With work-worn hands, he lifted the locket and hung it on a small nail beside the frame. The muted silver resting beside her smile felt like the closing of a circle that had been left open far too long. He sat back down, his gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the dark line of the forest lay buried in snow and fog, but Eli knew it was still watching. And he also knew not every mystery was something to fear. Some gifts come from the places we least expect, and they can change the way a man sees the world. The wind picked up, nudging the door on its hinges. Eli smiled, tapping his fingers lightly against the tabletop, a cowboy's quiet habit before rising for the next ride. If a legend returned your most treasured heirloom, what would you do? Share your thoughts. If you were the rancher, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments.